Well, Elizabeth, I am totally geeking out right now because I have been following your career path, and I was so excited when your book came out. Um, I was just so excited. Climate change and the environment is something that I talk about a lot, and so when your book came out, I just knew that it was going to be a fun ride and something that I could share with my audience. I just love that you build so much possibility and then you kind of knock us all down with that climate change is inevitable. And I love it. You don't explain, you show, and you take us on this ride. And it's a topic that is argued and dissected nonstop. And I love it. You keep trying to find a solution and to be better. And so being better, your last book, you won a Pulitzer with the Sixth Extinction. So with this next book, why? Like, why did you have to write this book? Why did you feel like it was important to you to follow up with Under a White Sky?
Well, I'll start by saying, I'm really glad to be here and thanks for having me. And it's great to have, people who want to talk about a book about a heavy subject. Although, as you were talking about before, I do try to have fun with it because really, honestly, what else can you do at this point? But what sort of led me to it, honestly, was after the Sixth Extinction, which was a pretty big topic. Let's just put it that way. But also, I do want to say I tried to, approach it with some humor. I felt a little bit like I'd, written myself into a off the page. What do you do next? And so, but then the question was, okay, so what do we do next? Where do we go from here? We are, and at the center of that book was also this, which is also at the center of this current book, is this notion of the Anthropocene, that we humans are changing the world really on a geological scale. We live at this extraordinary moment, where people have rivaled the great forces of nature that have shaped the planet over billions of years. And what are we going to do now that we're realizing a lot of the consequences of that we don't care for? And so the real project that sort of got me started on this book was I went to do some reporting in Hawaii. This story that's at the center of the book on something that was nicknamed the Super Coral Project, which was exactly this, an attempt to say, where do we go from here? Specifically with regard to coral reefs, which have been really already very badly damaged by climate change.
Wow. Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But I love that you take something that, well, first of all, I love that you followed it up because I felt you saying like, where do we go from here? And you ride this line within Under a White Sky of, do we do this or do we do that? And providing the alternative, which is, what is there an alternative? And I like that you give a myriad of answers and with humor. Speaking of, the coral reefs and making big changes to impact or reverse them, do you feel like these big ideas are going to be the problem solvers? Is that something that like, is there going to be one big idea that changes everything? Is it going to be multiple ideas? Is it small changes at home? Like, what are those things that, I think because we're all looking and searching for
Yeah.
an answer.
Well, with climate change, the problem, the jam that we've gotten ourselves into is that we can't really, there's a lot of, we don't really even have words to talk about it properly. It's something that, it's not a problem like that we're used to dealing with. Let's say you have, a toxic waste site. Let's just say you can, try to remediate that. You can try to remove the toxic stuff or treat it in some way and, encapsulate it. There are a lot of problems everyone knows. You try to remediate a toxic waste, and you put the stuff somewhere else, you may be creating a new problem. So I don't want to say that's simple, but at least we have ideas of how we can do that. But with climate change, we've just sort of unwittingly, by going about our daily lives, no one meant to do this. We just put a lot of carbon into the air. And then we realized, oh my God, this is changing the whole world, changing the climate. Um, but carbon dioxide hangs around for a long time. This is a key point. So, you put it up there, you're not getting it out. Although I do talk in the book about, possible ways we could try to take it out, because and those you're gonna be hearing a lot more about as we go into the future, because there's a just a need for that. And so even if we do, all the right things, and to be, really frank, we're not doing all the right things by any stretch of the imagination. But even if we did do them and we got to this idea of, net zero emissions, we'd still have all this carbon in the air. So the, sad fact of the matter is we need to do everything. People have often said about climate change, there is no silver bullet. There's silver buckshot, maybe, maybe many different actions will make a difference. Um, and and in the book, though, I do discuss a couple of ideas that are these really big ideas, like, okay, could we really actually reverse climate change? There's a lot of risks associated with all of these ideas. Um, but there are ideas floating out there. So that those are really interesting because of this question of, well, are we going to eventually look for sort of the Hail Mary pass? Like, okay, we didn't do the million things we should have done. Are we going to need to go for this long pass?
Out of all of the radical ideas that you talk about in the book, was there one that struck, that intrigued you the most, or that made you feel like, wow, that's really a genius idea? I think that could work.
Well, I mean, I think one of the most intriguing, ideas that I encountered in the process of reporting the book was this question of, are we going to use gene editing? So we're getting really good at gene editing, the technology known as CRISPR, which I'm sure, everyone's sort of vaguely heard of, at least, which is just the only thing you kind of need to know about CRISPR is just a way to do gene editing that's much cheaper and much more precise than previous ways. So it's made a lot of things possible that were not possible before. And, when you're in some of these critical situations with, and this is not a climate change issue so much as a extinction issue, to go back to our old favorite subject of extinction, when you're in a situation where organisms are really threatened and down to very low numbers, there are some cases where gene editing may be the last best hope. And are we willing to do it at that point? Would no longer be the same creatures exactly; they would be tweaked. But I'll give you just one example, which I do talk about in the book, which is the American chestnut tree, which was a really dominant species, in the Northeast, so where I live, killed off by a fungus in the middle part, I guess, of the 20th century. 4 billion trees died, the belief is. And we really have no chestnuts left, only these little spindly things. And scientists in Syracuse, New York have created a chestnut. It has one gene that they imported from wheat, and it's resistant to this blight. So they're sitting in these sort of fenced in plots in Syracuse, New York. And right now they're asking for permission from the federal government. Should they be allowed to plant these trees out in the world? And so there's an interesting choice there between a chestnut that has a wheat gene, it's a transgenic organism, and no chestnuts. And these are really hard questions that I think we're going to increasingly confront as gene editing becomes more and more sophisticated, and as more and more creatures are driven to this, terrible position.
Sure. It's so fascinating, the gene editing, because it brings in so many ethical questions that come with it. And then some just like the mundane, where we've been gene editing for thousands of years in a weird way because of a bacteria that might have edited, or, mating, or what have you. So it just brought up so many questions. I was up late, like chatting with my husband about it and, talking about your experiment that you went through with, is it the Odin?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's just, it's fascinating because on one hand, I also ride this line of like, do I just let nature take its course and ride the wave? Or do I have to adapt to the way that, like with vaccines or what, and I'm very pro vaccine, but just, to adapt with, the survival of the fittest, so to speak. And this gene editing is just such a, I don't know, it's such an interesting conundrum to think about. And,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think people are, sort of freaked out by gene editing, and I completely sympathize with that. But then you get into some really, hard choices. It's not like, um, one of the things I'm definitely trying to do in the book is bring home some of these tough choices. They're not as clear cut as I hope people come out of, on the backside of the book saying, well, it's not as clear cut as I thought going in.
No, and it doesn't seem that way. It seems like there are multiple factors and so many individuals at play creating their own grand idea of how to tackle this. And it seems as if they all have to orchestrate it together in order to even make an impact. It's just, it did not seem like a simple solution. So
Good,
it
good.
didn't seem like a light switch. I mean, I think in the end of the book when you mentioned that it's easier to dim the sun than to darken the sky. There was a reference that basically it was easier to make the sun dimmer than to tackle this big change. So it's
Right, 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 right. Yes, it's a guy who said it might be, and I won't use the epithet he used, but like, yes, we live in a world where it might be less dangerous to dim the bleeping sun than not to do it. Yeah, yeah, and that's a very, I mean, I don't necessarily expect people to agree with that sentiment, but that's a pretty profound statement.
where and how did you feel the need to start talking about environmentalism and climate change? Where did that passion come from?
Well, it's actually kind of a curious story. I actually covered politics for a long time. I used to write for the New York Times, and I wrote about politics. And I was actually hired by the New Yorker to write a political column. This was right around the year 2000, and I did write that column for a while. But this was right at the point where the web was sort of taking over the news cycle. So it was really getting really hard to write these sort of old style New Yorker stories where things wouldn't appear for weeks after, the actual event had happened. And it made me start to think about stories that, were going to be true next week and the week after and the week after that and the week after that. And I've always been, interested slash concerned about environmental issues. And so I thought to myself incredibly naively, I was going to write a piece. I was just going to write a piece about climate change and it was going to settle. This was the early 2000s. It was going to settle once and for all this question of whether climate change was real or not and whether it was something we had to be worried about and, put to rest all of this, so-called debate. And I started calling around to scientists and immediately they all said, oh yeah, this is real. This is big, And so I ended up writing a three-part series actually that appeared in New Yorker in, I guess, about 15 years ago. And that once you sort of start, as once you sort of start thinking about and reading about climate change, in my case, writing about it, it it's just such a compelling story, such a compelling issue, so important that it sort of takes over your mind and your life. And that's sort of what happened to me. So it began somewhat, as I say, somewhat naively with this idea of like, well, let's just answer this basic question, and has just kind of unspooled from there.
Sure. It's such a bigger it was a bigger issue than I even than I understood. Always knew it was a big deal, and then you start reading a little bit and a little bit, and then it kind of just spirals out like a tree.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah, exactly. It's everything, it's all encompassing, really.
is there anything that you can tell someone at home that can make them feel at least like they feel a little bit more in control of their actions and making a little bit of an impact?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, changing our habits and sort of, modeling better behavior to, the way you would do for your kids, sort of. I do think it's important, and I do try to do the, what makes a big difference. Well, how where do we emit a lot of carbon in our, electricity? I have solar panels on our barn. I drive a hybrid car, and I do will the next car I ever buy, I will buy an electric car. They're much, much more efficient. And so those are biggies. But I also do have to acknowledge that, in my work as a journalist, I travel a lot, I fly a lot. Flying is a really carbon intensive thing to do. So I try to be honest about that, and I also, I do genuinely grapple with that in my own thinking, like, is this trip worth it or not? But I try not to hold myself up as, a model of low carbon living, because I'm not. But, that being said, I I put the flying in this complicated box. I'm not sure it's ethically justified, to be honest, but where if I didn't do that, I couldn't do my job, So, and I'm sure a lot of people are in that position.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I can't imagine you writing about Greenland and never seeing the facility, and you'd have to have a firsthand account. That's very
Yeah,
tough.
it's tough. It has been, it's something as I say, I think about a lot, the whole flying component. And there are a lot of people out there, there are whole groups flying free. They're mostly in Europe where, the public transportation is better. But, the fact of the matter is, right, you're never getting to Greenland on public transportation.
So going back to making a difference and um, I guess to preserving animals and conservation, I'm looking at my notes about the pupfish and wondering about modeling good behavior to people and making a difference. How would you explain to someone why it's important to um, be a conservationist and speak on the behalf of a species like the pupfish or the cane toad, or not necessarily the cane toad, but
I don't think
but
we're saying that.
the
Yeah.
sugar plant, whatever. Well, how would you explain to someone like why that's important to fight for their rights?
Well, and I think that the simplest, um, argument is also, is an ethical argument in a lot of ways. So the pupfish that you're referring to, the devil's hole pupfish, is described as the rarest fish in the world. I don't think there's a lot of competition for that title. I mean, there's maybe a couple hundred of these fish in the world, and they were, even before humans, got involved in this situation, confined to one pool in the middle of the Mojave Desert, which was another place I got to visit in the course of writing the book, which is a great place, a beautiful place. It's sort of this cavern in the middle of the desert, and at the bottom is this beautiful pool of sort of bluish green water. Um, and the water's really warm. It's over 90 degrees, and most fish would not be able to survive in it. But this tiny little blue, iridescent blue, very beautiful little fish, the devil's hole pupfish, lives there and lives only there. So, in the 60s, people started pumping the groundwater in the Mojave, and the level of this pool started to fall. The fish was in a lot of trouble. So that chapter details, ways in which we're trying to save this poor species. And there were a lot of questions. I mean, when the federal government got involved in trying to save the pupfish, there were some people who put bumper stickers on their car that said "Save the pupfish," and there were some people who put bumper stickers on their car that said "Kill the pupfish." So emotions ran very high. My sort of best, so you can say, well, what good is this pupfish? Tiny little fish, no one's eating it, has no utilitarian value. But I think if we look at, we don't look at humanity for its utilitarian value. And I think that looking at other species through that lens, only through the lens of what good are they to us, um, is a pretty big moral failure. And if you look at a species as sort of an answer to this pretty profound question of, how do you survive on planet Earth? There are all sorts of answers to that question, each of which is sort of encoded in the genetics of a species. And you just do away with that, you're doing away with one of those answers. Now that answer on some level is as good as any other answer. Those fish survive for many thousands of years. So we're just kind of lopping off the branches of the tree of life pretty indiscriminately. So I find that argument to be the most compelling, but for those who do not find it to be the most compelling, I think there's an alternative argument, which is, we are simply evolved creatures like, everyone else. We're even though we have these sort of, supernatural powers, as it were, we're still dependent very clearly on the natural world, which we get reminded of, at moments like, the Texas, blackout. But all our food, all our oxygen, these are all products of biological processes. And, there's this question of how many species you can do without before some of these systems start to unravel and have very serious implications for humanity. So that's an alternative answer to that one.
No, I'm all for saving the pupfish. It's just an interesting argument. I think in one of I forget which chapter, and it might have been the pupfish, where someone was saving the pupfish and someone said, well, what does it matter? And the scientist says, well, what do you matter? And it was
Right. Yeah. What good are pupfish? And his answer was, what good are you? And it's a pretty profound question. What do you think about it?
But I feel as though we're so out of tune to nature and to the noise, to the sounds. I think I was listening to, it might have been in a documentary that you were in Austin, or Headspace or something, but talking about like the noises that whales make, and that it's something that's out of our range. But I feel that we are so out of range for so many different noises and sounds and movements and whatever it is, that we're so out of touch and out of sync for how we fit into this world in general. We're just so out of touch to understand why someone or something like a pupfish actually could have a profound effect on our lives because of the whole ripple effect of their extinction.
Right. And I think that, the pupfish are an extreme example because they're so restricted, and you do have to ask the profound question, okay, this one little fish in one little pond, what good is it? But as we sort of just willy-nilly, change the climate, mow down the rainforests, then we're talking about, there are also a lot of species that, that we could talk about also, that like there's a list of of birds called common birds in steep decline. So these are just, ordinary birds. Populations are crashing right now. And that's when you really do have to get worried about sort of whole ecosystems unraveling. I do think, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of pupfish. I don't think, any ecosystem is going to unravel, because if we're the pupfish to go extinct, which I certainly hope they do not, but there are creatures out there that are so central to all these food webs that were you to pull them out, there's a famous metaphor that a scientist named Paul Ehrlich came up with, and it's like if you're on a plane, and you pop one rivet, okay, there's a lot of redundancy in the engineering. Presumably the plane can continue to fly. You pop another rivet, okay, it's not so good, but okay. You keep going, and at a certain point, the plane is going to crash. And that's sort of this experiment that we're running without knowing exactly which rivets we can do without. sort of trying to figure out why they happened, what caused them. But people might have seen, if you looked just the other day in the New York Times, they did this really cool animation of these ocean currents. And one of the questions is, are we messing around with ocean currents in a way that could cause a really abrupt big climate shift, like those shifts that they see in the ice core record? So that's definitely sobering.
Yeah.
We'll
That's a good
put it that way, yeah.
Oh man. Um, all right, I'm gonna go back to my question. Sorry. With that being said, that sobering statement, then what do we teach the next generation? How do we learn from how we're royally screwing things up right now? How do we learn from ourselves? What do I teach my kid? How do we teach this next generation to make a bigger and better impact?
Well, I mean, one thing that I do feel is important to do is to sort of not be we need to be less dug in, if that makes sense. We're gonna have to be willing willing to change. I think that is kind of maybe the central lesson, like, um don't think this is the only way to live. Don't think because I think our kids are, I have older, college age kids or whatever, but I don't think the future is going to be like the past. Like, we were very fortunate, I was at least grew up in a time of relative peace and prosperity, and seemed a more stable world. I think kids today feel like it's a very unstable world. The pandemic certainly hasn't helped that. Um, and I don't want to say, like, just embrace instability, because people obviously aren't designed to do that. But I do think that we can be more um, open to new ways of doing things. And one of the problems that we're having now is everyone sort of so polarized and so committed to their way of doing things. I don't know where that's all going to lead. That's another conversation about contemporary American politics. But I think it's important. The one lesson, I guess, if I could impart to young people, would be, okay, yeah, things are going to change. We're going to have to grapple with that. We're going to have to try to do that as best we can, and as peacefully as we can, and as broad-mindedly as we can. How's that?
No, that's great. I think especially being diplomatic about it, we're so America centric, that we don't think
Yes.
about other countries and how it might impact them. I mean, the statement of where we make up, I think, what is it, 16% of the carbon or whatever, and then another country like Africa makes up a teeny little
Yeah.
amount. We
Yeah.
can't all expect to be on the same playing field when it comes to what we're
Yeah.
responsible for.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that another message, I think that, and this is American kids, not the kids in Africa, but, definitely, there's a big sense of, I think, um, there should be a big sense of responsibility, because we, as Americans, it just so happens, it turns out, we're responsible for more carbon emissions that are in the air right now than any other country. So we're like, I think it's like 4 or 5% of the world's population, but something like 30% of the carbon that's up there. So that's a pretty big responsibility um, that we have to try to make things better.
Yeah. No, I again, I'm reiterating, but I really love that you're able to attack it with such humor and having fun with it, because it's such a heavy subject and it's already filled with doom and gloom often, because these statistics are really tough to swallow, and it feels very like, well, what's the point? And I feel like if we can come at it with a sense of humor of, okay, this is inevitable, this is happening. Let's be tongue in cheek about it. And then let's, I don't know, have a more positive outlook. I feel like will be very inspiring. And I know it's inspired me. Um, you know, I think it's just a great approach. And I think that's what makes your book so fun and appealing to read, is that it doesn't feel so doom and gloom. It feels very like uplifting and
Well, thank you. I do think that people are, I definitely did try to write it so that at the very least it was a fun read, when you're done with it, because it is such a heavy topic. I do think people, or topics, I mean, it really deals with a lot of topics, I guess, but definitely there's this like, I don't want to hear anymore, you know.
Yes. Yes, and that's how the subject often is, and I felt like every page I couldn't wait to read more. I loved science so much. So for me, learning about all the genetic modifications and the cane toads and the coral and the sails in the sky and the and it was almost sci-fi and kind of wild,
Yes.
weird, and it really gets you going of how many there's so many options and so many opportunities, I'd like to think, of where we can go with this. And so it was definitely a fun journey and a fun ride. And what do you think is the best way to start appreciating nature more and becoming more conscious about the environment?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I have an answer for that, but I myself am a big hiker, and I think that just getting out into the world, I mean, I think a lot of us live in, you know, urban settings where every effort has been made to eliminate, other, creatures and other, forms of life, and just actually getting out into, you know, your nearest park or your nearest state park, or better yet, your nearest national park, but we're not all near national parks, or local park, is really is step number one, and you're gonna see things and encounter other species that you're just not going to see, in a city or a suburb. I grew up in the suburbs, and I now live much in a much more rural area, and there are a lot of things. We never saw a frog, for example, where I grew up, because everyone was dousing their lawns in these chemicals that the frogs couldn't stand. And now one of my favorite things, which is about to happen, I hope, is that the spring peepers will emerge from the winter and start making this incredible racket. And I think that having those experiences, especially for kids, is absolutely crucial.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's one of my favorite things to do with my children is to get them outside and listening to the sounds. And it's almost an anticipation of the next season too.
Exactly.
That's awesome. I'm so appreciative of you being here. I've really loved chatting with you. I love, love, love your book. Is there anything else that you want to cover, or anything else you're working on that people will be excited about?
Yeah. Well, I want to say, thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everyone who showed up today. And I am especially grateful that, for yours, seeing the humor in the book, because that is really important to me, that came through.
It absolutely did. And we're very appreciative for you writing it that way. So thank you.